now we're going to talk about WISE, the 2019 presentation. And so WISE stands for With Intelligence, See Everything. And so what is it? And so WISE does many things because it's WISE, but it basically will enhance your session data with other data. Very simple. It can be hooked up to many different data sources, including simple files, commercial sources, URLs, Splunk, Redis, Elasticsearch, and then other people write their own plugins and hopefully contribute them back. It supports multiple layers of caching, and I'll go into more detail about that in just a second, but basically Capture, WISE, and Redis can all be used for caching the results so they don't hit the sources, especially commercial sources, constantly looking up the data. It can be used to set almost any field in your sessions, and you can even use it to create new fields and new displays of those fields. So here's an example of one. You know, we use a name similar to Matt, except we have an S. The subnets that a particular session transversed. So basically every single IP address we see, we look up in our subnets database through WISE, and then if it matches anything, the data that's in those files is fed back to the session and is placed in there. And all of these fields are first-class fields. You can do everything that Elise showed earlier with this data. So you can search on it, you can get the unique values, whatever you want. And so in this case, there's a match of this particular IP address, and this is how the session was labeled. Another example is we're users of Threatstream, and so again, we look up every single IP, domain, MD5 inside of Threatstream, and any results that come back from Threatstream can be added to the session. And so here we had a very high severity malware domain that was tagged, and so all the data that was in Threatstream is placed in the session. So when you open it up in Moloch, you'll see what the Threatstream results were. And one of the differences between this and other integrations is this is done at the time of capture. And so you'll know what the state was at capture time as opposed to viewing time. So you may have viewed it many months after you captured it. And you want to know at capture time, what were the results in Threatstream, because it might be totally different than now. Here's an example of SPI View, and again, the Threatstream data source. So remember, SPI View shows all the unique values for a field. In this example, I just opened up a bunch of the Threatstream fields, and you can see all the different unique values that we're seeing, and you can click on any of these and do searches or whatever you would want. So it's a 3-tier architecture with WISE. You have your capture servers that are running out there, and they all have the WISE plugin running. And there's a little WISE cache in there too that's caching the data for 5 minutes by default, and so that it doesn't even have to go to the WISE server constantly for particular IPs as the packets and sessions go by. If there isn't a match in the local cache, it will go off to the WISE server itself. And the WISE server can be configured with an INI, and I'll have an example in just a second, about where to go for every query it gets. And it can use Redis as a cache, or it can also use just its memory as a cache. We recommend setting up a simple Redis cluster with Sentinel. It makes WISE a lot faster, especially if you're doing reverse DNS lookups, because it will cache all of the results for you, so it doesn't have to hit the DNS server constantly. And then WISE, if it doesn't have the results in its own cache or the Redis cache, will actually go out to the data sources to find the information. Some of those data sources are really kind of in memory, like the files one is kind of part of WISE, but other sources like VirusTotal and OpenDNS is a query out to the service to get the results. And those can be rate limited. So for example, with VirusTotal, if you're doing the free tier, I think it's 4 minute, some low number, it's going to query those up or queue those up and only do those 4 minutes so that it's not exceeding the rate. You can and you should set up a multiple WISE servers if you have a big complex, like if you're doing like we do, several hundreds or thousands of gigabits per second, you're going to need more than one WISE server. And so what you would usually do is you have a bunch of capture servers it's going to hit some kind of load balancer. That's your WISE load balancer. And then the WISE load balancer is going to go to the actual WISE instances. Each of those whatever, is talking to the Redis master server, and then you'll have a bunch of replicas potentially of the Redis servers. We use Sentinel. You could also do Redis clusters. You could do a Dynamo or whatever, Dynamite. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. With 2.1.0 of Moloch, we've switched to a much better Redis library that supports all of these different things. The one that we used prior to that only really supports some of the basics for Redis, but now we support all those different configurations. And like I mentioned before, we're using Sentinel, but you can do the other ones too. So setting up WISE is pretty easy to get started. You just, in your INI file for capture and viewer, you just have to tell it what your what your WISE host is. You have to set the plugins that you want to load on the viewer and on the capture instance, and then you just need to restart those things, and you're done. Well, not really. You still actually need to configure the data sources in WISE itself. But on the capture side and viewer side, it's very easy. On the WISE side, you come up with a INI file where there's a section for each data source that you want to supply to WISE. And all of them are either full names like Threatstream, or they'll contain prefixes like file : or URL : which says it's going to be the file type and then a unique name. And this is just so in statistics that WISE prints out and other things that can keep them all separate. And they can all have their own configuration. And I'll have an example in just a minute here. And then there's some configuration that can be used across all of them that's common. And then each source sometimes have its own configuration option. And we have a lot of documentation on the WISE settings page. So here's a very simple one of what a configuration might look like. There's the WISE service section, which applies to everything. And in this case, you can set up excludes for IPs, domains, and email addresses. So here we're excluding these domains from ever doing anything in WISE, because if for whatever reason they hit WISE, we know we don't want to look them up because they're either not going to be in there or they're just not something we want to look up. And then the next two things are examples of sources for WISE. One is the reverse DNS source, and the other is a file. The name of the file is badbadbad.ip. So reverse DNS, I think as Matt mentioned earlier, will match any IP that matches the list of IPs there, and they can be CIDRs, will be looked up. If you don't match those IPs, it will not be looked up. So if you're worried about exposing what you're looking up or whatever, you can limit it, or you can allow everything to be looked up. It's up to you how you want to configure it. In this case, we're only looking up, for example, maybe IPs that we control, and so we don't care if we're exposing that we're DNS looking up these, or reverse looking up these. And it's going to set the asset field. You can change it to set any field you want, but in this case, it's the asset field. The second example here, and there's more information later, is we're going to load in this file that has a list of bad IPs. And it just displays, defines what format that file is. We support several different formats: JSON, this tagger format, and CSV, I think are the three. Tagger format is one that we we made up for this original tagger plugin that we had, which was the precursor to WISE, that probably most people don't use, but it still exists. The tagger format is really easy. It's just basically a list of things. It's almost like CSV, but instead of commas, it's semicolons, and it's just one line per item that should match, and then what to do with that match. And it's a little bit convoluted, but in this case, we're just matching IPs, and it can set which fields and their values. And you can either use the shortcuts, or you can use the full names. So when it says 0 equals, that means it's a shortcut, and shortcut 0 is defined up here what it means, or it can use the full name. So for example, tags, it'll go and actually set the field tags to that one. So you can do either way. So similar to that subnets example, you might have an IPAM database where you have an official database of what your IPs should look like, as opposed to just something that someone put together of what your IPs look like. And you can set up Moloch to do a JSON query or whatever you want to get that results from IPAM. And again, there's all going to show up in your sessions or your SPI view. And this example was done doing JSON. And so it's just a URL query. It's saying that the format, it's going to be an IP type query. We're looking for JSON data to be returned. We're going to reload it every 60 minutes. The column that has the key information is the CIDR column, or it's actually the field, sorry. The field, even though it's called key column, it's the field. And then this is the fields that we're going to support displaying. And so what this will do is it will go and fetch this URL every 60 minutes. And by default, it's expecting to get the full database back that it's going to load into memory. You can do other kinds of queries where it has to do a query for every lookup. That's usually not going to scale very well. You usually want something that can dump it from somewhere so that Wise can load it all in at once, but you could do it either way. And so here's just a sample of the JSON that comes back. And remember, CIDR was what was called the key column or the key field. And this is what is going to be used to look up an IP address as it comes through. And if it matches this, it will set the data center to none, security zone to none, and similar, if it matches this one, it's going to set it to office and none. So again, every query is going from Moloch capture to Wise, and Wise is looking up in its data sources, and then it's returning it back to capture to add it to the session data. And it's cached at both the capture level and at the Wise level. So it's very fast. Here's another example where you can use Elasticsearch. And for this one, again, we're looking up IPs, but we want to look up what username is associated with that IP address. So this would be, this is, I guess, our PanOS VPN. We're writing logs into Elasticsearch, and it's going to do a query for each user. This isn't one that does a query and get a dump. This is doing a query for each user. And when it passes in the IP address, and it gets back a result. And so here's an example of the result. So if we did a lookup for 10.10.10.10, Elasticsearch is going to come back and say, oh, this is the record I have for 10.10.10.10. The source user is Andy Wick. This is the timestamp. And so it will go ahead and set this data. And so you can associate from your VPN logs sessions in Moloch to who was on that IP address during that time. So you can see in Moloch, the VPN user that was there. And so just a new field called users would show up. Recently, we did Splunk support. And so this example here, we're going to Splunk, the same type of thing, where we want to map IP addresses to the user who's behind those IP addresses. But in this example, instead of doing a query per user, we're going to Splunk and saying, dump all of the last, I think it's 24 hours, yeah, 24-hour assignments from IP address to users. And we call this every 60 seconds to find out who has what IP address. And so what's going to happen is this is going to go to Splunk. You would fill these in with your username and password and the URL for Splunk. It's going to go there, log in. It's going to continuously download that and do this query against Splunk. You have a Splunk expert come up with this query, because I didn't. And then now it can associate IP addresses with data from Splunk, if that's where your VPN logs are going. Wise can also be used as a centralized location to do right-clicks. So right-clicks, which really should be called field actions or some better name, since we no longer support right-clicks. I don't know. We need to rename it. We should have a vote. Left clicks, yes. So left clicks allow you to add to the user interface URLs that show up for particular fields or categories of fields, and it will automatically build those URLs based on what you've clicked on. And there's a whole bunch of substitutions that can be done. And you can either centralize, download those from Wise, or you could push them out to every single Moloch sensor. But this is an example that they're centralized in Wise, and they can be auto-reloaded, and you don't have to restart anything, which a lot of people like. So Matt already showed an example about creating views. They're written in this language called Jade, or now it's been renamed to Pug. but we don't like that way. There's a new way where it's much simpler, where you just list the fields and the title of the show, and it will generate the code behind the scenes for you. What this does mean is that you can't just put any random HTML. So this solution doesn't support the unicorn picture like Matt wanted, but it does support a much easier way where you just list what fields you want to show up, and it will generate all of it for you. So that was one of the exciting things we've added.
This is in what, in wise.ini?
Yeah. This is all wise. The other thing that's relatively new is we've talked about how you can do IP addresses and MD5s and URLs, but you can actually use wise for any field, and you can change the definition of what MD5 means or what IP means if you've added some field that Moloch doesn't know about. You can actually go in there, there's a new section called wise types where you can map, like MD5 here, I'm remapping to these are the things that I mean when I want to look up MD5. Or now I'm creating a new type called MAC. That these are the two fields that I'm going to use for MAC lookups. And then everywhere in your wise configuration where you said type equals IP, you can now say type equals MAC. And it would automatically know that, oh, there's this new type that I'm going to do lookups about, and new files to go to, and new data sources. So some of the things that we want to get to this year, and we're hoping that this year is kind of the year of wise, we'll see if we can get to it, is we want to add some more UI, or actually any UI to wise, just to make the configuration a little bit easier and to see what wise thinks is going on clearer. Because right now it's just APIs and configuration and kind of some finger crossing to hope it all works. And now adding some UI would make that a lot easier. And we want to make it easier to create sources, just like we kind of simplified how you define views and fields. We want to simplify just creating sources. It's always hard to come up with new ways to do this, but open to suggestions. And one of the biggest things that we don't support super well is multiple wise servers on the same machine. I mean, you can do it, but for example, the Threatstream implementation would end up doing bad things if you ran two Threatstream wise servers on the same box and they shared the same Threatstream database. So we need to figure out a better way to handle that. If you're not using Threatstream and you're just using raw files, there would be zero problems with the current implementation, but we just want it to be zero problems for all sources. And we definitely need to include more examples. We have like one example, and then we have some stuff on the web page. But when packaging the releases, just like the rules, we want to start including sample rules. We want to start including sample-wise configurations so that people can have a place to start. Right now, a lot of people come to us or come to the Slack channel, and it's like, where do I start with wise? It's kind of hard to get your head wrapped around. Great, any questions?
I like the interface into Splunk to be able to pull things, if I'm understanding it, from Splunk and add them as decorations into the Moloch data in Elasticsearch. Do you have any provisions for going the other way? Can we take things that Moloch has observed and send them into Splunk so that they get loaded in along with other data in a different event information system?
Currently, no, we do not. I mean, we've talked about different ways to do that. We've done, I mean, it also depends if you mean you want to do alerting or if you want to do just other things. If you want to do alerting, back to our principles things, we don't want to get too much into alerting, although, you know, I see my non-boss in the back of the room nodding his head that this is what he wants. But
was that the one who said that he could never get you to do the things he wants?
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Very good. So if you have ideas, love to hear about them. The general issue is around scale and Splunk and data rates. So lots of people have Splunk issues when it comes to how much data you can shove at it, including ourselves. You hit the, whatever they call it, the threshold of what you're allowed to ingest, and we don't want to be the ones that over-exert that. If you're talking about alerts, then you know that wouldn't be an issue if we're just putting in some stuff. And what we have done is we've made it so that you can kind of augment where we write to, but I don't think anybody has written a plugin that actually uses that. Someone asked for the feature, we added the feature, and I don't think anybody used it. Where you can write a plugin and see that registers and says, I want to be involved in writing the SPI data record. And I don't know if anybody's done that.
Okay, so the hook exists,
Yes, there's actually several hooks.
but we would have to go write our own module to be able to capture whatever it was we wanted and send it then.
Or
into Splunk.
make a feature request with details of what you want, other than I want to stick stuff into Splunk.
No, I got to let our own Splunk team do some work.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, okay. So question is about using WISE from other tools. So let's say I'm kind of working on something in a back room myself, and I know you can query the WISE sources, just /IP and the IP, and then I discovered that the output wasn't actually valid JSON, so it looks like not many people are actually using it.
Yeah.
It's a one-line fix. I can make a pull request or just show you the line because maybe it's easier for you to fix yourself. But anyways, plus, if you query it from this way, you do it like one lookup at a time, whereas, capture does bulk requests asynchronously. So I was just wondering, like, if this is something you're also thinking about, like, doing, like, making WISE usable as a threat intelligence source from other tools, because right now the API that Capture is using isn't, well, I more or less kind of understand what you guys are doing, but I have no idea how to actually go around using it.
Okay. Yeah, so great question. So yes, we want to do that, and we actually did have that for a little while, where we wrote a Bro plugin that would query WISE instead of using the Bro Intel files, which I can't stand, but I know people love. And then we found a bug in Bro, and so I filed a bug report where it didn't close file descriptors, and it would crash after you did 256 queries. And so they fixed that, and so we want to try again, but we have not done that yet. Parallel to that, a great example might be VirusTotal, especially if you're only doing 4 queries a minute and you have lots of tools that want to do it. That would be another great place to be able to use something like WISE, because it's centralized, it's storing the results in Redis for 2 hours, so it doesn't have to requery those, et cetera, et cetera. And yeah, I would love to do that.
Because yeah, like from just where I come from, we live in a lab, so there's like these exercises we do with like this year during one exercise they're like 1,140 something subnets. So keeping this information in memory in WISE is actually trivial.
Right.
But there are other tools, like not just full packet capture, but also like log streaming and enrichment tools that we would like to use, like for tagging suricata alerts and all this kind of good stuff. And using different inputs, like different databases. At one point, it just both.
Yeah. No.
And WISE is a really nice tool for centralizing this.
Yeah. So we should do it. Make it work better. If you have a fix. Yeah. So if you already have a fix, please submit it or just email me or whatever. Let's get this done.
I can show you mine.
Okay. Great. Anybody else? So I think we have a 10-minute break now. So let's have a break. There's a few cookies left and whatever. Thanks.